Day 8. Remember when you were a kid and you built something wonderfully dangerous like a pirate ship using all the pillows you could find, and you're in the Caribbean on a swashbuckling adventure with your little brother using broomsticks for swords, right? And then suddenly some stupid grown-up walks in screaming to stop because it's all fun and games till someone loses an eye, followed by an angry query as to what the hell are all the pillows doing on the floor? And suddenly you're at home again and the ship is gone. And you're just standing in a mountain of old pillows, realizing that this maybe was in fact a bit dangerous, and you could have maybe hurt your little brother. That is probably about how the Soviet leadership felt on the 8th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, except it really was the Caribbean, and it was nuclear missiles, and it was in fact extremely dangerous. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is TimeGhost, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yesterday, President Kennedy had made public to the world that there were Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles on Cuba and announced a blockade to stop any further Soviet arms arriving on the island. He had claimed there was no desire from the U.S. to take unilateral action and start a war. But the actual plan that he has set in motion includes an invasion of Cuba and possibly even the total annihilation of Cuba if the Soviets do not remove the missiles and warheads immediately. Out of a Soviet perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis starts today, October 23, 1962, after Kennedy's announcement. Until now, it has been Operation Anadyr, a bold, secret adventure to finally even the odds a bit with the Americans in the nuclear arms race. Or, as Khrushchev phrased it, putting one of our hedgehogs down the Americans' trousers. They had known that the game was up for some days, and when it became apparent that the announcement was coming, they convened their version of XCOM, the Americans' executive committee of the National Security Council that's dealing with the crisis on the other end. Theirs is a subset of the Committee of the Communist Party with some military thrown in, and it will meet in several different constellations as the crisis proceeds. In this first meeting, the main participants are Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who is now under increasing political pressure as his economic reinvigoration plans are failing, his de-Stalinizing reforms stalled, and now his grand foreign relations adventure is on the brink of failure. Chairman of the Supreme Soviet Leonid Brezhnev, formally the head of state, but in practice the second most powerful Russian politician. Brezhnev is a longtime faithful Khrushchev friend and ally, but has secretly started moving away from his failing leader. First Deputy Chairman Alexei Kosygin, another Khrushchev friend and ally. Kosygin favors soft power and a rapprochement with the U.S. He's also drifting away from his failing friend and will eventually lead the coup against him and become the next premier in 1964. Deputy Chairman Anastas Mikoyan, as we already know, he is the only member of the Politburo that has opposed Operation Anadyr. He was the first to visit Cuba after the revolution and knows the Cuban situation better than anyone else in the room. Mikoyan also favors a rapprochement with the U.S. and liberal reform. On a side note, his brother Artem Mikoyan is the airplane designer that partnered with Mikhail Gurevich to create the MiG aircraft designs. True story. Second Secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Suslov, a staunch ideologue sometimes called the Pope of Communism. He is vehemently opposed to rapprochement with the U.S. He leads Khrushchev's main opposition and favors a hard line against the West. First Deputy Prime Minister and Chairman of the Committee of Party and State Control, Alexander Shelepin, the former head of the KGB and now political leader of the party branch that controls the KGB. Shelepin is a serious communist hardliner and the architect of fueling communist rebellions and revolutions in other parts of the world. As such, he's been instrumental in helping Castro and Che Guevara take control of Cuba and believes in an aggressive, militaristic foreign policy. Defense Minister Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, as we know from the previous days, Malinovsky is a traditional military man that opposes the use of nuclear arms in any conflict. Although he was a co-architect and early supporter of Operation Anadyr, he now questions the operation as being out of hand. Deputy Army Chief of Staff General Semyon Ivanov supports Khrushchev to direct Operation Anadyr from the Kremlin. He is a career military man and does not get involved in the political side of things. The group meets for the first time at 10 p.m. Moscow time on October 22nd. Now, this is 2 hours before Kennedy's address, and they have received neither the letter from Kennedy nor the transcript of the statement, but they have been informed that they are on their way. General Ivanov gives an update on the deliveries of arms. Several new shipments have left port on their way to Cuba with more material. Most ships are too far away from Cuba to make it across the blockade line before it takes effect. However, one very important ship with a 4-ship escort is close enough to maybe make it into port before the blockade takes effect. It is the Alexandrovsk, a large Swedish-built cargo ship carrying 24 1-megaton nuclear warheads and 44 14-kiloton warheads for tactical cruise missiles. Malinowski opines that the U.S. will not go to war over the situation if not further provoked. He believes that Kennedy's statement is a stunt for the upcoming elections, but he also believes that further provocation could worsen the situation quickly. Khrushchev sides with Malinowski and says, "The point is that we do not want to unleash a war. We want to intimidate and restrain the USA vis-a-vis Cuba. The difficult thing is that we did not concentrate everything that we wanted and did not publish the treaty." See, as the Americans were a few days ago, Khrushchev is concerned with the legality of his actions. Okay, they do have a defense treaty with the Cubans, but it's secret. So this now makes them look bad and weakens its legality. They argue about announcing the treaty immediately via radio, but don't, since it's unclear if this would help or worsen the situation. Khrushchev concludes, "The tragic thing, they can attack and we will respond. This could escalate into a large-scale war." This leads to a discussion about the appropriate immediate response. The hardliners advocate allowing the forces on Cuba discretion to use their tactical arms in case of any U.S. aggression. Malinowski points out that if such an order became known, it would give the U.S. justification to strike back with atomic force, especially if it came out that the order was given before Kennedy's address. Remember, we're still ahead of Kennedy's TV speech. Obviously, there's also a risk that actions resulting from the blockade could escalate into a nuclear exchange without Kremlin control in that way. For now, they decide to order the Cuban forces not to use the nukes and decide to revisit the subject in the morning after they've read Kennedy's note and transcript. They decide to inform agricultural specialist Pavlov, aka General Pliev, on Cuba to make his troops combat ready. They order all boats that are still in the Mediterranean to turn back to Russian ports. The ships that are in the Atlantic but have no chance of reaching Cuba before the blockade takes effect are ordered to hold for now. The Alexandrovsk, with her deadly cargo of warheads totaling over 30 megatons of explosive power, 3/5 of the Tsar Bomba, shall proceed to the closest Cuban port. They adjourn the meeting for the night and await Kennedy's missives. When they meet again, they have regained some resolve. They create a laundry list of actions to undertake, including informing their allies and the public. They draft a resolution for the UN Security Council, and they write a strongly worded protest note to President Kennedy. They decide to send a telegram to Castro, informing him that they will stand by Cuba, asking him to come to the next UN session. They will also immediately inform USSR Ambassador to the UN Valerian Zorin so that he can start preparing for a face-off with his US counterpart Adlai Stevenson. The most significant decisions they take are military or about legality of action. 4 nuclear-armed Foxtrot-class submarines are on their way to Cuba. Their purpose is to take up permanent base in the port of Mariel. Codenamed Operation Kama, this is a response to the permanent placement of U.S. subs armed with ballistic nukes in the port of Holy Loch, Scotland. Now, the 4 submarines are still far away from the blockade line, but are to proceed as ordered and try to run the line. This decision will eventually prove central to the chaotic escalation of the crisis. Last, but not least, they decide to not officially announce the defense treaty with Cuba. This too will prove central to the outcome of the crisis. So, the Soviets have decided to stay their course, but will try to avoid a direct confrontation on the blockade line. They're playing for time. In the communication to Castro, they note, "It was halfway successful and half not. It is positive that the whole world is focused on Cuba now. Time will pass, and if needed, weaponry will again be sent. Meanwhile, in the U.S., President Kennedy is turning words into actions. He meets with all the members of the OAS, the Organization of American States. This is the continental organization of cooperation between the countries in North and South America. Cuba was excluded from the OAS in January 1961 on grounds that Marxism-Leninism is incompatible with the inter-American system. Kennedy manages to get a unanimous vote ratifying his blockade. Moreover, under the Rio Treaty regulating mutual assistance between the OAS states in case of aggression, several other nations will participate actively in the blockade. Argentina, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela will provide ships, air support, or even ground forces. Trinidad and Tobago offers the use of Chaguaramas naval base, 2 warships of any OAS nation, for the duration of the blockade. Kennedy then spends the rest of the day in a series of meetings dealing with the details and minutiae of how to enforce the blockade and still minimize the risk for outbreak of general war. We'll get back to that in a few days. At 6 p.m., he signs the proclamation for interdiction of the delivery of offensive weapons to Cuba at the Oval Office. The blockade will now enter into effect at 2 o'clock Greenwich time tomorrow afternoon, October 24th, 1962. The line will now be set at 800 nautical miles from Cuba. When the last meeting with the ExComm ends, the Kennedy brothers are alone in the room with the recorder still on. The president is on the phone with the First Lady and then returns to his brother. They return to the crisis. Robert Kennedy expresses frustration about not having direct communication with the Soviets, and the president asks about the spy Georgy Bolshakov, who had been Robert's liaison with them.
Hey, George. No, he had lunch today. What's he say? He said they're going to go through. The ship's going through? He says this is a defensive base for the Russians. It has nothing to do with the Cubans. Why did they lie to him? Shit about the election. The sickening thing was code that he was very mad that they revealed about this harm, because that embarrassed me in the election.
Robert Kennedy now goes to an off-the-record meeting with the USSR's ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Dobrynin. RFK's message is simple. Tell Khrushchev to start communicating openly with President Kennedy. Dobrynin repeats his statement from previous meetings that there are no missiles on Cuba. In fact, he's not aware that he's lying. Nobody has told him about the missiles. RFK advises him to check his facts with his own government and returns to the White House. There, he joins the president, who is split from his dinner party and is now taking drinks with British Ambassador David Ormsby Gore. The ambassador gives the president some advice. Move the blockade line from 800 to 500 nautical miles so that the Soviets get more time to consider their options. Kennedy immediately calls Defense Secretary McNamara and has the line moved. On opposite sides of the Iron Curtain that night, the two most powerful men in the world go to bed fretting and worrying about their political futures, while the rest of the world sleeps restlessly in fear of the nuclear world war that those two leaders may have just launched. Join us tomorrow when the blockade goes into effect, and it looks like Russian ships might try to pass it after all. If you want to get notifications on regular episodes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, our playlist is right here. Do not forget to subscribe, and please support us on Patreon so that we can make more awesome history. Good night and good luck.